CO everyone, this is Cheeky Mo, and I'm Cherokee Charles, the Cherokee that can see. And today, I'm going to tell you what I see. Today's topic, we're going to talk about recession and GDP. We're going to talk about what a recession is, what GDP is, what it means to you, and where both of them are going in the future. So let's get into it. Now, the government defines recession as 2 consecutive quarters where there's a fall in GDP. Now, I know a lot of you hear this kind of analysis on TV and, you hear these acronyms, GDP, and you're not really sure what it means. But GDP is defined as the gross domestic product, and it is defined as the total value of all goods and services produced by the United States. That's everything. Everything we make and all the services that we provide. Whatever the total value of that is calculated to be, that's what GDP is. Now, we are in May, and the end of the second quarter will be the end of June. So we got a little over a month to go before GDP is calculated. So the question is, are we already in a recession? And if so, when do you think the government's going to officially make it agree that we are currently in a recession? Well, let's kind of go back in history and talk about recessions. Currently, back in 2019, GDP was calculated to be $21.4 trillion. That is what they calculated the total domestic product to be before COVID hit. Now, GDP is calculated 2 ways. The first way is calculated is the value of goods and services at the time of sale or at the time they are consumed. And that calculation is the first way GDP is calculated. The second way GDP is calculated is by each step in the process of creating those goods or that particular service. So for example, let's use a loaf of bread as an example. Now, a loaf of bread in the grocery store that sells for $5. Well, in order for that loaf of bread to get into the grocery store to sell for $5, a farmer had to grow the wheat. He had to collect the wheat. He had to process it. He had to send it to a manufacturer so that they could manufacture the wheat so that they could make dough. And then the dough had to be made into bread. And then the bread had to be packaged and sent to the grocery store. And then the grocery supermarket manufacturers had to agree on what the price would be for that loaf of bread. And then you, the consumer, would go to the grocery store to buy that loaf of bread for $5. And that would be considered the second way we would calculate GDP. The value at each step of the way in the process of making that loaf of bread. Now, which way is it actually done? I think it depends on who's doing the calculation and which way they want to do it at that particular time. Now, also going back into history, when was GDP created? Like, what was the reason that we needed this report? Well, GDP has been around since 1934, and it was created because Congress wanted to know what is the value of all the goods and services that the United States produces at that particular time. And we just come out of a Great Depression, and the government was trying to do its best to not have that repeat again. So they asked an accountant to create a report that would tell them. And the accountants worked with economists to come up with a report that was created by the National Bureau of Economic Research. And they created this report, which is we now know as the GDP, and they gave it to Congress so that Congress would have some idea of the total goods and services produced by the United States. Now, most countries produce a report, their own GDP report, by data that is published and tracked through a national statistics agency. Here in the United States, we do it a little bit differently. The US calculates GDP. It is calculated by an organization called the Bureau of Economic Analysis. And that bureau gets data fed to them by various other government agencies. And some of those agencies include the Internal Revenue Service, the Census Bureau, and the Federal Reserve. They all feed this report with data from these resources. Now, the problem I have with that is that there is no standard for reporting and how this data gets reported. The IRS does it one way, the Census Bureau does it another way, and the Federal Reserve does it another way. So is the data that's reported as GDP wrought with the possibility that there could be errors? The answer to that question is yes. It is possible that the calculation could have mistakes in it. Now, how do I know that? We know that because many times when GDP is reported and then the second quarter comes around, many times the government will restate the GDP numbers, which means that the GDP numbers were massaged a little bit. And the government goes through this process of checking to make sure that the GDP numbers are accurate, and they may restate them. And they may massage the numbers a little bit. And the reason that they do this is because the government will do everything possible not to have 2 consecutive quarters of GDP decline. And the reason that they don't want to report 2 consecutive quarters of GDP decline is because that means that officially we are in a recession. And no government, no administrative body wants to actually report that to the people, because that would mean to the people that things are extremely bad. We're in a recession, prices are going up, and you can expect bad financial news in the future. And no government agency wants to report that to the people. So what do? They massage the numbers, and they do everything possible not to have to admit that the country is in a recession. So what should we do? Pragmatically, for the average person, you should automatically assume that we're in a recession. You don't need to be officially told whether or not we're in a recession or not. You don't need to be officially told. You should assume that you're in a recession and act accordingly. Now, since we're still in May and we still have a month to go, the question is, what do you think is going to happen over the course of the next month? Do you think that things are going to improve to the point where when they calculate GDP, the calculation will show that we're not in a recession? I think not. I think that there is nothing that is going to take place over the course of the next month that will correct all the mistakes that we have made up to this point to get us into this recession. Now, don't forget, the reason that we're in this recession to begin with is because last year we started to flood the market with money. The government told the Federal Reserve to start printing money, and we're going to give this money to the people. And that's exactly what we did. We flooded the market with all this money. And people were home because of COVID. And we weren't producing anything, we weren't servicing anything, and we were just spending money. Now, you can't just produce money and shove it out into the market and stop all production and stop all services. That is going to create what we now know today as shortages. And that's why we have shortages. No production, yet the market is full of money searching for goods and services. That's how we got in this mess in the first place. So, as a result, GDP has been going down. Now, is GDP going to suddenly turn around in a month, in 30 days, so that we can report that GDP is now rising? I don't think so. But stay tuned. I'll be back and I will report what's happening. And as usual, Cherokee Charles here, the Cherokee that can see. I'll be back. Do not forget to like and subscribe. Send me a comment and tell me what you think of the Chikimo channel so that we can give you the best news for you possible. And as usual, I'll see you in the next one.